morning everyone. So today we're off on a bit of a cycling adventure around London. We're checking out the magnificent 7 cemeteries which are dotted around the inner London suburbs of London. When they were built, they were of course on the very edge of London, built during the Victorian age. Poverty, cramped living conditions led to an increase in diseases, and as a result the cemeteries in inner London were just sort of overflowing, that people were being buried on top of each other. They were using chemicals and stuff so bodies could degrade quicker, so then they could bury people right on top of where previous people had been buried. And subsequently an Act of Parliament was passed and these 7 new cemeteries were built. Part of the land on them is unconsecrated ground as well, so all of them have a number of people buried of either non-believers or of different religious faiths other than the Church of England. These are 7 really famous cemeteries, and a number of famous people have been buried in them, so it's going to be a bit of a long cycle today, hopefully an interesting adventure. Come with me, this should be a bit of fun. To our first stop, we're here at Kensal Green Cemetery, and this is the first one of the Magnificent 7, so it was completed in 1833, and as you're going to see in a minute, some of the sort of like places around here sort of it's a bit eerie, a bit spooky, but that's what you get with a cemetery. But some of the sort of tombs are absolutely magnificent. We've got a number of different people who are buried here. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, but then there are also people such as Kelso Coltrane. He was a man who was brutally murdered in the 1950s in a racist attack in Notting Hill, just down the road by Ladbroke Grove, and there was a massive funeral procession where thousands of people gathered onto the streets as he was taken up here to be buried, and that funeral was organised by some of the people who went on to organise Notting Hill Carnival. Along with those two, we've got sort of circus stuntmen buried here as well, so a great sort of variety of people. So we're here at Brompton Cemetery now. This is our second stop of the day. This was finished in 1839, and it's some really interesting history to hear. So Beatrix Potter used to live around the corner, and she actually named many of her characters after wandering around the cemetery and spotting names on graves. So Peter Rabbit is named after someone called Peter Rabbit, for example. So is like sort of Mr. Todd and other names from her books as well. Famously, Emmeline Pankhurst is buried here as well. She's probably the most famous resident, as well as Jon Snow, not the Game of Thrones Jon Snow, but he's the man who basically worked out what was causing cholera, that it was spread via dirty water. If you go to Soho, you can find outside a pub, there's a water pump where he sort of made his discovery by, so you can go and check out that history too. So he's buried here as well. The exiled Prime Minister of Poland during the Second World War was buried here, and this area has a really interesting Polish history too. So during and after the Second World War, lots of Polish refugees from the Nazis and then refugees from the Soviet Union came and settled in Earl's Court. So after the Second World War, there was a really strong Polish community around this area too. Okay, so I hope you found this bit of history interesting. We're going to continue with our cycle down to the south of the river. Okay, we are now south of the river and we are at stop 3. We're at West Norwood Cemetery, third of the Magnificent 7 cemeteries we're trying to stop off at. This is the busiest one that we've been to so far. Cars keep going up and down here and I keep having to sort of retake this video. So this was the first of the cemeteries built in the neo-Gothic style, and we've got a number of significant people buried here. Probably the most significant and perhaps controversial is William Tate. He's the person who donated to the Tate galleries, and he donated often to things without putting his telling people he donated to them. He's also the person who sort of owned Tate and Lyle Sugar, and obviously we're talking about sugar in the Victorian era. That is a industry that is built upon slavery. So he himself didn't own any slaves, and was working after slavery was abolished in the British Empire. However, the foundations of that company was built on slavery. So that is something that we have to remember. Even though he was a philanthropist, we have to remember where he was getting his money from, and that is from sort of sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And also there are some people suspect that he might have had sugar plantations in sort of Brazil, which still had slavery in those sort of areas. So but it's hard to prove that and hard to sort of trace that back. But it shows the importance of like visiting these places, that we should bear in mind who these people are being remembered and sort of evaluate their history in a little bit more depth. He built his empire and his fortune on most likely the exploitation of others, and probably on the foundations that were laid by slavery. So anyway, that's our third stop. We're going to go on to Nunshead Cemetery next. Right. Okay, we're here at Nunshead Cemetery. This is stop 4 of our tour. This is our last stop south of the river before we get on the ferry and head over to Canary Wharf and onto the final three of our cemeteries. The first person to be buried here was a man called Charles Abbott, and he was a 101-year-old greengrocer from Ipswich, who I think at the time lived down the road in Catford. And I think that's just quite a nice sort of story of someone from quite a humble origin who was sort of buried here. And I guess interesting for me, from a family perspective, where I've got sort of my ancestors were butchers from sort of Norfolk, who then moved to Catford. Who moved to Catford and lived around this area once upon a time. So yeah, sort of family connection to the story of sort of migration around the UK there. Anyway. It's absolutely boiling here. Need to reapply sun cream, and then we're gonna get a move on, get some lunch, and then crack on. We're at stop 5 now of our little cycle. It's getting pretty late and it's absolutely boiling now. But we're at Tower Hamlets Cemetery. This was built in 1841, so a bit later than some of the other ones we've looked at. And it's sort of located here in the heart of Tower Hamlets, and it's really got some really interesting history as well. There are a number of unmarked graves here, which are to people who were lost at sea, and it has sort of graves to different seamen from across the world because of how close this cemetery is to the London docks. It's also where someone buried named Clara Ellen Grant. She was an educator who worked in the area of Bow, who created a number of schools to help disadvantaged children. Also, one of the people who is buried here too is a gentleman who run an ironworks facility in the area, which is where West Ham Football Club was actually found. So if you look at West Ham's like football emblem, you've got hammers on it. That's because they were the ironworks football team, and that's where they sort of originate from. Okay, good morning. I hope you're all well. So on Thursday we didn't actually finish doing our 7 of the Magnificent 7 cemeteries. This is because my camera ran out of battery on the 6th of the stops at Adney Park. So we did make it to the one in Stoke Newington. However, I only got a few stills. I wasn't able to record a video. It was also really, really noisy, so I wouldn't have picked up any of the audio. So therefore we decided not to cycle to Highgate, so missed the last stop. But we're going to go back there today, so we're hitting up Highgate first, and then we're going to Adney Park in Stoke Newington, and then we'll have all 7 of the cemeteries done. So let's complete this adventure. finally made it to Highgate, the last of our cemeteries in the Magnificent Seven, and this is probably the most famous one. It's where Karl Marx is famously buried here. However, the first burial here was to an Elizabeth Jackson in 1839, and she was just an ordinary person who lived in Soho, who was buried here outside of what was the city at the time. Other people who were buried here include famous sort of bare knuckle fighters. An example of one of these bare knuckle fighters, Tom Sayers, and over 10,000 people turned up to worship his funeral, including his dog. It's got a huge mix of people, everything from sort of massive economists and philosophers such as Karl Marx to then ordinary people, and bare knuckle fighters and entertainers are buried within these cemeteries. Okay, so we've made it to our final stop of Adney Park, which is in Stoke Newington. The hieroglyphs above the gate as you enter, they read a extract from a hymn written by Isaac Watts, who is buried in this cemetery, and it reads, "To the abode, to the mortal part of man," and that's just written just above the gates. Famously, this cemetery, there are many dissenters and non-believers who are buried here, and the chapel just behind me allows anyone from any religion to be buried in it, and it's for that reason that many dissenters were attracted to this cemetery and why they are buried here, and among them Isaac Watts, who as I said, there's a statue of him here as well. He is responsible for writing sort of thousands and thousands of hymns too. Alongside Isaac Watts is Charles and Catherine Booth are buried here as well, and they are the founders of the Salvation Army, and so they're sort of significant people who are buried here. Another person who's buried here is Bestie Cadwallader, who is known as the Forgotten Florence Nightingale. She was 60 years old when she went to go and fight in the Crimean War and clashed repeatedly with Florence Nightingale. But her story's forgotten. But the most unique thing about this cemetery is that it's an arboretum. There are over 2,500 different varieties of trees and plants within the grounds of this cemetery, and it is definitely the most green and the most forest-like of all the ones that we've been through. And it's probably the busiest. There are so many people sort of walking about in here and sort of enjoying a nice walk. It does sort of feel strangely like a sort of green oasis within London. Anyway, that's us finished for our Magnificent Seven tour. We're now going to try and find coffee and some food somewhere.